Hi, and now I'm over here. The session has started. Just a second, let me adjust this volume. Great. So I just want to do a double check. First of all, it's a real pleasure to be able to talk to the teachers from Math for America. Are people able to hear me at this point? Do we have a sound? I can see all of your chats. I can see what everyone is typing, so that will work. I'm also going to stop this video so that it doesn't use as much bandwidth. Yes! Okay, so then we're through. All right. John, how should we do this? Do you want to wait a few minutes to let everyone come in, or do you want to, what do you prefer? I'm happy to do whatever is customary. I will say usually when I do these kinds of events, sometimes it takes a few minutes for everyone to come, but I'm not sure what you guys prefer at Math for America. Sure.
And in the meantime, New York, just a reminder, New York City teachers, there will be a signing Google Doc that is listed, but hold on, why is, oh, it's your, okay. But for New York State, you keep attendance on your own.
Yes, we'll be starting this on the YouTube very soon. What we're waiting for right now is that this session is primarily for Math for America teachers. And so there's a Zoom meeting that we are all in. And this YouTube channel is also open for anyone who's curious about the topic. You're always welcome to stop in and just watch. I am going to apologize in advance to people who are watching only on YouTube. I'm unfortunately myself not able to see the comments that are being written because I'm using multiple devices here and the other computer is focused in on the Zoom classroom because again, that was what I was supposed to do this evening. This evening I was supposed to be giving a session only to Math for America, and they kindly decided to just open this up to the whole world. And so anyone who's watching is always welcome to watch. You're of course, you're welcome to chat with each other on the chat. That's completely fine with me. Great. And we're just going to wait like maybe a minute or two more, just in case there are some more Math for America teachers who are coming in to join. I will actually use this time to also put a plug for Math for America. I do this because I think that they're a fantastic organization. I think it's really, really rewarding to be able to have this opportunity to talk to some really, really motivated and interesting math teachers on a regular basis. Every time I give a session there, I'm just stunned by the fact that I mean, it's just so much fun. It's just so much fun because these are all mathematicians, really. Everyone's a mathematician who's thinking and wants to see new ways to look at math or teaching. And so I do this, in fact, 3 times every spring. I do 3 sessions every spring. And normally it's only in New York in person. But because we are unfortunately all stuck at home, I'm now also doing this in a way that anyone can see coming from the internet. Okay. And I'll let our host decide when we should officially start the session. Oh, by the way, I can see the chat. Somebody said, can someone help me troubleshoot why my iPad won't let me have the Zoom window and the YouTube live video up at one time? That's a really good question. I didn't think about that one carefully. I don't know if you happen to have 2 devices. If you happen to have 2 devices, the easiest thing to do would be if you opened one on the iPad and opened the other on your laptop or your phone or something. Most likely, the Zoom is the less important part until it's time to type. I guess in that case, you probably want your Zoom to be something you can type on. That's in fact what I'm doing, by the way. The way I'm doing this is I have multiple computers. One of my computers is only signed into a Zoom meeting, and it's projecting right in front of me everything that people are doing in the Zoom meeting. And I have another computer which is being used to record the broadcast and stream it all over the world. Ah, yes, opening 2 tabs and using one computer, that works perfectly fine as well. Yes, we're good to go. So in that case, yes, wow, you guys know more than I do about splitting screens. I didn't know that was possible, but it sounds like we got the go-ahead signal from Math for America, so I'll go ahead and start. First thing is that the topic for today is not what we're normally talking about. The mini course that everyone signed up for, which I was planning to teach, was why matrices. And the reason I wanted to teach about matrices is because the concept of linear algebra, or even working with matrices, is something which oftentimes when we learn in school, we don't necessarily learn how it's useful or what it's good for. It's just a lot of operations that we do. And in fact, even the reasoning for why we do the various operations is not clear. Now, I was supposed to give a session about that today. However, as some of you know, I actually recently released a potential, I don't want to call it a solution, but I released something which can help us as a country, as a world, to come back towards normalcy with regard to the COVID-19 pandemic. And in fact, it's an app, it's a free app, and inside the app, the heart of it actually involves quite a lot of math. So in fact, because that app just happened to be released today, and also because at this moment in my life, I'm actually being asked from all sides by people representing government or whatnot, asking what to do with this app, I didn't exactly have the time to go and make the ideal lesson on determinants, which I wanted to give you guys. So instead, what we're going to do is we're going to in fact talk about a real life, directly relevant topic right now called COVID-19 epidemic and what that has to do with math. Now, I know that the audience here is a range of different teachers. We have teachers who are teaching, I believe, even in elementary school, as well as teachers who are teaching even in high school. So we have a big range. And my goal is to talk about a variety of different topics that could actually be useful, especially if you have students who are wondering, how does this math that we're learning have anything to do with solving a real world problem? So I'll actually tell this a bit as a story. And the story is relevant because it's also showing you how maybe I, as a mathematician, was thinking about the epidemic and how I started to realize that I had to do something. And the way that this started was that it started from when the first cases started to emerge in China. So when things emerged in China, I heard that there was a virus. I heard that it was in a city called Wuhan. And I didn't know whether I should be worried about this. In fact, at the beginning, I thought I probably don't need to be worried about this because we live so far away. But then after a while, by the end of January, I started to find out that there were people in the US who had just come from that particular city, and they were testing positive for this virus. Actually, at that point, a bit of estimation kicked in, and I started to realize that this was a much bigger problem than what we thought. And so the first topic is a bit of statistics. It's actually some statistical idea. This part has nothing to do with the app, but I just wanted to talk about all of this because by the time we get into the app part, maybe that particular area of math might be more relevant for students who are much later stage in school. And I want to be able to talk about different things that could be relevant to how, as a mathematician, if you look at the current situation around us, we can realize that there's something that needs to be done. So the first thing is, I found out that there were people coming from that particular city, and those people were testing positive. And they were testing positive at about 1 per day. I'm about to do a Fermi estimate. So this is a calculation where I have no actual numbers that I can use. And this was at a time when everyone was saying that maybe this is not a very big deal. Maybe this is a small issue. Maybe there aren't that many people who are sick. But I thought it was kind of mysterious. How can it be that about one, let me just save this first. Okay, great. How can it be that about one person per day from that city, how could it be that about one person a day from that city tests positive in the USA? So there were some official reports about how many people in the city were sick, but this is a very interesting number because I don't need to look at those reports. I can start to work out my own probability. My own probability is based on how many people per day come from Wuhan to the United States. So if I was going to do this kind of a calculation, I would estimate that there were about 100 flights. What I estimated is that somehow there are about 100 flights from China to the USA. And what I was estimating is that out of these 100 flights, each flight has about 300 people. Each has about 300 people. And if each has about 300 people, I also want to know about, you cannot hear anything except a little music. I'm trying to see. My gut is that everyone is able to hear. Can I just do a quick confirm? Are people able to hear? Yes. If so, let me know, and I'll just keep going with the story. Yes, okay. And by the way, if you went to the wrong link, you might have clicked on some pre-recorded video. This is the live video. It's the one where I'm actually talking. Although actually, unfortunately, me saying that has about as much use as saying, hey, could everyone not in the room please raise your hand? So in this, I'm actually very thankful that Math for America has a facilitator who's helping to type all of these things into the channel. Thank you, John. Okay. But back to this basic estimation. If I have about 300 people, my numbers, by the way, could be off by a factor of 2 or 3. I just want to know a ballpark. So at that point, if I have 300 people, the next thing I need to know is, on average, or what is the fraction of people who come from China to the United States every day who have been walking on the streets of Wuhan in the last 10 days, which is where they could have gotten sick. And I just estimated maybe like 1%. I'm just giving some rough estimates here, right? So I said, here's a rough estimate of how many people every day are on these flights. And now I need to multiply that by the by the proportion of the people who are actually potentially walking around on the streets of that one city. And what I estimated was, maybe about 1%. About 1%, because it shouldn't be 10%. Somehow the big cities are Beijing, Shanghai, Shenzhen, and Guangzhou, and they have tons more people who are traveling on airplanes. But if about 1% of the people were on the street in Wuhan in the last 10 days. So like in the last 10 days. So from all of this, what I can figure out is that one person tests positive out of multiply all these numbers together. These numbers are chosen to be easy. So if you multiply all these numbers together, what you get is 1% times 100 is nice, and those cancel, and you just get 300 people. And so what this gives you is a very shocking number. If that's true, I don't promise that's true. But if it's true, you get a really shocking number, which is that multiplying these together, there are 300 people a day coming from Wuhan. Multiplying all of them together, 1 out of 300 of the 10 million people in the city, Wuhan, are contagious. Well, are potentially infected. Well, are infected. That was extraordinary. So when I figured this out, this was back in January. Actually, I figured this out and I thought, wow, that's actually a very, very high proportion. In fact, I didn't even believe this. 1 in 300 is huge, by the way. 1 in 300 times 10 million. Now, that's the kind of math I can't do. Honestly, that I do find that very hard. 1 in 30, okay, so 1 in 300 of 10 million. That's 1 in 30 of 1 million. That's 1 in 3 of 100,000. So that would be like 33,000 or something. I probably did that wrong. Yeah, like 33,000. You got this kind of a number back at the time when everyone believed that there were only like a few thousand who were infected. But when you make this calculation, then you realize this could be a bigger problem. In fact, I didn't believe this. I thought this was a huge number. But these days, when we look at the kind of statistics that are going on in the United States, in various cities that are actually heavily infected, we're not that far off from, we're not that many orders of magnitude off from this. Okay, so that was the first thing. And this is just an example of how, if you use mathematics, even if you don't have very precise numbers, you can actually work out some numbers from the other side. I made some huge assumptions here, by the way. One assumption I made is that the person on the airplane is a random person on the street. Although what I would have thought is that if this originated from a seafood market, I would have expected that the probability that one of these airplane riding people was there is in fact lower. So actually, these are people who are even less likely, I would have thought, to have the virus. So that was item number 1. Then item number 2 is related to graphs. So I thought this one is relevant if you happen to have students who might be learning pre-algebra. And my numbers could be all off, but the important thing is just to see how with the percents, you can go and figure out how to get a rough estimate of what's going on at a time actually when most people in the world don't think that there's a real issue. The second thing that happened was about a graph. Just a second. Let me save this. The second thing that happened was about graphs. So this was around March 16th, or around March 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, this time. This was around the time that the United States suddenly started to try to lock down. In fact, because we were all trying to flatten the curve. And so at that point, it became quite necessary to have a curve. What was the curve talking about? When there was a curve, then the curve was basically saying, you would have time on one axis. This is just a graph. And on the other axis, what you had was the number of cases, number of current cases. Let me write that more clearly. Let me just say number of cases now. And so when you have this kind of a graph, many people saw that the graph looked something like this. People saw that you might get this kind of a curve. And the other thing that was on this diagram was a little line. That's when I got very worried, by the way. When I got very worried was when I realized that there was this other line on the diagram, somewhere around here. And this line was called the healthcare capacity. So that was the healthcare capacity. And what people were saying about flatten the curve was, if you have more cases at any particular time than the number of ventilators that we have available, then we'll have a big problem. Actually, you're probably right. That's daily new cases. Thank you very much. It is very nice to be able to give a math talk with math teachers in the audience. You guys are very, 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 very helpful. So let's just call it the number of new cases. We can do that. That, in fact, is actually more useful for what I'm about to say. So that's the number of new cases for each particular day. And when you draw this graph, it actually tells you right away, as a mathematician or a math teacher or a math student, we get it. We cannot afford to have people above that line. We cannot afford to have the green line above the blue line. Oh, yes, because that would actually cause a trouble. Then there would be people who can't get access. And now I see there's a question. Thank you. I'm glad that people are asking questions. So, Anne Lorenzen, you have a question about the curve. Would you like to... I think what we were doing was we were typing, I think. Although if people prefer to talk, I'm actually okay with both because I actually can hear out of this side. Active cases. Yes, the curve I drew. Is that the rate? So the curve I drew and which is shown here, that's not the rate at which the rate is changing. I believe that these graphs were usually saying things like how many new cases we got on each day. I think that somehow that seems to be what we're seeing the statistical results say. It's like somehow there's an axis, which is here are all these days and how many new cases reported today. So, yes. So now people are curious, like what should that curve look like? Should that be the logistic curve? Should that be the logistic curve or should that be an exponential curve? Something which I saw which is a problem is that I saw some people think it's just a normal distribution. In fact, I saw some articles written which said, yes, so you draw a normal distribution and then that will be the curve. Actually, there's no reason in the world why it should be a normal distribution. The normal distribution is something that arises in statistics. It's what happens if you, say, flip a coin a lot of times and you count how many heads you have. And if you try to graph how many heads you have when you flip a coin many times, it follows a normal distribution. And that actually is because of something called the central limit theorem in mathematics. That's actually a theorem that says it's going to converge to a normal distribution. This actually shouldn't necessarily be that exact curve. In fact, it's what we call the logistic curve. And where this curve comes from, actually this one you can also talk about some math too. It's quite interesting. So this particular part of the curve at the very beginning is where it's growing exponentially. And why is it growing exponentially? The reason it's growing exponentially is because the general way that a virus transmits is like this. Suppose you have a bunch of people who are standing somewhere, living somewhere, and here are all these people. If you have all of these people, then the way that a virus transmits is that at some point someone gets sick. And due to their pattern of behavior in relative life, oh yes, so you said the logistic curve would be the cumulative case. No, you might actually be right. So to be perfectly honest, so thank you, Kim. I actually myself don't know the exact nomenclature of when you use one particular, like what is the particular name of that curve. All I know is the process. I unfortunately am one of these people who likes to think about the concepts, and so sometimes I actually don't have the exact name. On the other hand, what I will say is at the beginning, it definitely looks a lot like exponential. If this is the derivative of the logistic curve, that one I can believe. And that actually probably makes sense, because you're right. I agree with you. Actually, I remember. Logistic curve is indeed something that does this. The logistic curve eventually tops off. And so, yes, we have math teachers here, so we have the derivative of the logistic curve. That's probably what this is. And the reason that makes sense is because when you have anything spreading in a community, somebody is the first one who gets sick. And due to the regular behavioral norms of the people in that community, that person will typically get too close to a certain number of people on average. And too close meaning close enough to infect them. So as this is happening, in the first round there's this one person who's sick, and maybe that person gets two people sick. By the way, I drew these far apart because that was what was going on in the United States and in many other countries while everyone was still able to fly everywhere. I myself was one of those people who was also going to lots of different places. You could fly, you could drive, and generally speaking, you would potentially infect two people and they could be far apart. Now, that means that however many cases you had in one time, the next one is twice as many. So approximation of the derivative, yes, thank you. So indeed, I myself probably wasn't precise enough on some of the language. We're talking about approximation of the derivative because this is something which is discrete anyway, which is somehow how many people are infected how many people in total are infected on any day. And when you talk about the derivative, we'd be talking about the difference from one day to the next. And so that would be this discrete derivative, which is this thing that we've drawn here. Discrete derivative just means you take like f of x plus 1, f of t plus 1 minus f of t. So thank you. Actually, whenever you guys hear something that I say that seems a little odd, please do say something. I actually really appreciate that. Okay. Now, as we keep going, it's like the first person was sick, they got two people sick. In their normal way of life, as those two people are walking around, they also get, each of them gets two people sick. And the reason that the model works this way is because somehow, if people don't adjust their behavior, then they will indeed get about the same number of people sick when you take these big averages. So not that everyone gets the same number of people sick, but on average, each person transmits to a certain number of people. For example, maybe that one transmits to two people. And what we see is that on the day 1, there was 1. On the day 2, there are 2. On the day 3, there are 4. And this thing is actually related to what's called the R0 of the virus. So we hear a lot of people talking about the R0 coefficient. And the R0 is effectively measuring, suppose you go with your normal daily life, about how many people would you infect on average. With a virus, if the R0, oh yes, somebody said discrete derivative estimates on some time interval, small time interval. And indeed, this day-to-day does work. So with the R0, if you happen to have a situation where the R0 is less than 1, then that's a situation where you're not going to have continued growth, because it just means that on average, the number of people that this one person infects is less than 1. And so if I had a certain number of people infected on one day, on the next day, you'll have a smaller fraction. And in fact, you'll get the exponential fall off. That's actually what you might imagine is happening over here, but we'll explain that for a different reason. So that's what happens when the R0 is less than 1. On the other hand, when the R0 is more than 1, you get this kind of explosive growth until, at some point, so many people are sick that when the next person would have gotten someone else sick, that person was already sick. And this is the concept of herd immunity. We also saw this appear in the news as the United Kingdom was considering using herd immunity as one of their techniques before that got highly, highly unpopular and actually shot down. And people said, we're not going to do that. But the idea of herd immunity is that somehow, if so many people have already been sick, and if it's true that you can't get sick again, that's a big if it's true you can't get sick again, then even though on average you would try to infect R0 people, inadvertently try to infect R0 people, out of those R0 people, some fraction of those would already be infected. And if some fraction of those are already infected, that actually tells you when this starts to drop off. When this starts to tail off and you don't get any, when you start to not get more cases, well, actually what I mean by this is that the rate of growth starts to tail off. Because if you could imagine that you got to a bad situation already where half of the people are already sick, the R0 will, the R0 of coronavirus, let's pretend it's 3. Actually, it's somewhere between 2 and 3. But if the R0 was 3, at the beginning, everything is tripling, meaning however many people were sick, now there's triple as many sick. But if at some point half the people are no longer infectable, then even though you tried to get 3 people sick, half of them, they wouldn't get sick. So your R0, or not the R0, but the rate of growth would reduce to a times 1.5. So that's the basic principle, is that as you get herd immunity, as you get more and more people who are no longer susceptible, then even though your daily behavior causes this to grow by like R0, then you would actually have a situation where at some point the number of new people infected the number of people each person infects becomes less than 1, and then you start to drop off. I saw one of the teachers mention it seems inappropriate to display healthcare capacity on the same scale as number of new cases. That's a really good point. That's why, there's a question of the axis. Should the axis be something like number of people who are sick? Maybe that's what you mean, because somehow healthcare capacity is related to how many people who are sick. And so actually in general, this diagram in general, in my opinion, has quite a few problems. One of the problems is, as you say, how should you actually label the axes? If I choose to label the axes in this way, it could make sense because on average, the amount of time that somebody needs a ventilator might be about 10 days. And so that you won't deviate too far from that average. And so if I looked at the number of new cases, what I would need is I would just need that this healthcare capacity is maybe at such that 10 times that number of new cases, and that would be enough. You are right, the currently number of infected would indeed be useful. And I will also say, I think that the conversation we're having right now is actually a very valuable conversation to have if you're talking about graphs like this with your students. Because this becomes a question of what should you do with these axes. Somebody said number of current hospitalizations is indeed the most precise compared to healthcare capacity. You're right. Actually, that's where I get to the next thing. So the first thing is I wanted to explain somehow you're going to have this growth all the way up to there until you have reached a point at which you're supposed to infect R0 people, but once you take into account how many of them already are infected, then you actually you start to peter off. Your R0 becomes less than 1. Let me write that down. So, and I'll get some of these comments because they're actually very good. So suppose I had this R0, and suppose you reach a point where, on average, only, I'm going to make up a number, 0.9 over this R0. Sorry, I have to write it in subscripts because we're mathematicians. We're mathematicians and math teachers, right? So it's 0.9 over R0. Only about this many fraction of people can still be infected. If you've reached this point, then somehow you're going to infect R0 people, but actually you're not, because only this fraction of them are susceptible. So you'll actually effectively only infect like 0.9 people. And that causes you to have the number of new cases to drop down exponentially, because that you're now multiplying by 0.9 every time. So now I saw a bunch of questions. One thing is that, indeed, what we should be looking at is like the number of current hospitalizations. We should compare that to healthcare capacity. And in fact, what we need to do is we need to figure out what we could do to either increase the healthcare capacity. I mean, that would be nice if you could. That takes some time. But for these new cases, what you're sort of curious about is what fraction of the people are actually going to need that healthcare coverage. So this is also where you can find some numbers. So I, in fact, asked some people on my team to maybe help me figure out what some of these numbers might look like, because I was curious who drew the axes. And unfortunately, the story is not great. So I went and did some research, and it turns out that this particular graph, this particular drawing, was the same drawing that was included in a 2007 paper about a different epidemic. So this particular drawing that has the line cutting through halfway, that's not based on facts about the current pandemic. And actually the concept of flatten the curve, what people said was, well, you see, here are all these people who are going to get infected. So what you do instead is you at least stay home. If you stay home, that R0 decreases. Because if you have adjusted your behavior, then the number of people that you might infect ends up being a much smaller factor. And so at that point, you're not going to infect as many people, and the rate of exponential growth will slow. But actually, because of what's going on here with this comment that I put down here, whatever the R0 drops to, as long as it's still infecting people, as long as the R0 is still such that you can get people infected, even if you make this kind of a shape, by the time you're done, there is something called the integral. That's what we're going to talk about next, is the area under the curve. The area under the curve is still going to be a significant percentage, where significant might be 10%. It's still going to be a significant percentage of the entire population. So to me, as a person who works on, I guess I do combinatorics, we often call a significant percent to be something that's even like 10%, because we call that like a constant factor. 10% is huge, because if that was really 10%, it's that any 10 people around you, if you looked at 10 people, on average, one of them was actually going to have gotten this virus. And so the idea is that if I looked at this curve and the other curve, the flatten the curve notion would have been whatever that's supposed to mean, whatever healthcare capacity is supposed to mean, we wanted to drop it down, but the integral needs to stay still large. And that's when I started to be curious. What kind of an integral do we need to support anyway? And then I went and found some numbers about what percent of the cases are estimated to require ventilators. This becomes what's called a pigeonhole principle problem. I was curious, how many days do you need to be on a ventilator? Sorry, let me turn it the other way around. It turns out that something like 5% of cases needed to go on ventilator, and they would need to be on ventilator for average of 10 days. And once you figure this out, then you say, if that's the case, and there are only 160,000 ventilators in the United States, it turns into a calculation problem. You just divide and you see how long would it take to actually get everyone through the ventilators if you actually put this kind of a line above. And the number that came out when I did this calculation in middle of March was something around 9 months to 12 months. And at that point, I thought, oh no, this is actually before. At this point, this was still in the news. Everyone was saying that we are not really going to have to lock down for that long. I see there was a question. Isn't the social distancing component and other factors changing the amount of infectable people? Yes. And so it's going to have some role in leveling off. So the question is, what does the social distancing do? So the social distancing, it actually doesn't reduce the number of people in the pool. We still have the same total number of people in our country and in our world. On the other hand, it effectively reduces the R0. So for example, if I make it so that everyone's in solitary confinement, their R0 is now 0 because nobody can infect anyone else. If you make it so people are so limited that they can only see one person every day, the R0 will drop. Why is that relevant? The reason that's relevant is because this, roughly speaking, is the fraction of people who will get infected. Roughly speaking. Well, that's not actually true. But this is like, roughly speaking, at what point when the fraction of people infected, this is not number of people infected. This is number of people who still could be infected. This is the complement. So what I mean is, if you have reached a point where only 0.9 over R0 fraction of people are left to be infected, then the epidemic will stop expanding. So if you look at that, because that's the complement, if you happen to make the R0 really small, suppose you made the R0 like 1.1, so it's barely infectious. If the R0 is 1.1, then let me just look at these numbers. If I had a 1.1 for R0, this would be like 9 over 11. And that would mean that you would already start petering out as soon as there were only 9 out of 11 fraction of people left to be infected, meaning that you would only grow fast up to 2 over 11 of the population. Does that make sense? I'm basically using this as I'm saying this is the complement of how many people, of the fraction of how many people are infected at a state when the infection is still growing exponentially. So the social distancing component, that helps to reduce R0. In fact, when you look at people discussing different ways to reduce the spread of the virus, a lot of times what people are saying is, can we find ways to reduce R0? And if you could ever reduce R0 less than 1, you're in good shape. If you can reduce R0 to close to 1, you're also in good shape. And this 0.9 I just wrote down because it's convenient. I could write 0.99. The only important thing is it's something which is less than 1 over R0, at which point things are starting to peter off. But as you know from adding geometric series, it actually still adds up. It's that somehow, if I have that, there are 5 people, if there are k people infected today, and every day in the future, it becomes an additional k over 2 people infected, that's a geometric series that in fact adds up to 2k. So in some sense, you'll still be adding up that side. Okay, but so I'm just sort of saying that when looking at this graph, that's when I was very curious, where did the graph come from? And I went and did the research and found out that the graph picture itself was drawn from somewhere that had nothing to do with the actual coronavirus. And unfortunately, then it was misleading for people to think that you could do this. Actually, if you looked at the numbers, the graph was much worse. If you looked at the numbers, in reality, the healthcare capacity was not that blue line. The healthcare capacity in reality was something like this. And then if you have something like this and you try to do social distancing in order to flatten the curve below it, because of the fact that you still have to run until a large fraction, a significant fraction, like 10% of the entire US population gets infected, unfortunately, that means that you end up running a very, very, very long period when people cannot go to work. And that's when I realized that something had to be done. So I was telling this story just to show how if you use this math to think about things, at the beginning, that's how in January, before we knew that there were many cases, you were able to sense right away, there's something going on here which is much worse than what we thought. And in fact, it's not even maybe anyone's fault. I don't know if anyone was even reporting those cases. Those were possibly contagious people that people had no idea were contagious. And in an early state of the virus, who knows anyway? But with the math, you can figure it out from the other side, just seeing how many people anyway are coming to the US. I have a denominator for my fraction. The second piece was this. The lesson to students, if you're teaching students, is whenever you look at a graph, exactly what you said to me. What are your axes? Excellent. But then the next question is, where did the graph come from anyway? There's a very interesting article online which talks about the history of that graph. By the way, I think that the strategy was still correct. The social distancing is the correct thing to do because we had nothing else. See, the point is this, if the graph really is this thing that I showed, it would be awful. I know that we're giving this talk to mostly teachers who are in New York, and New York City would have been in an absolutely terrible state if we did not do something like this because of the speed of exponential growth. So this strategy was correct, But then the problem is, this strategy has another problem that comes on the other side, which is called unemployment. It's called all the restaurants having like a restaurant apocalypse. And when restaurant workers don't have jobs, they don't buy things, and then somehow everyone, the entire economy spirals downhill. And that's when I decided to start thinking about this, when I realized this part. And this was around 3 weeks. It was around 3 weeks ago on Sunday, just over 3 weeks ago on Sunday. My history of how I was thinking about this was actually because when I was a PhD student, one of the sources of funding that came that paid for my PhD study was from an organization called the Fannie and John Hertz Foundation. And they had a very interesting setup where they would give you funding for your PhD, and you signed a moral commitment at the time that you took the funding, saying that if the United States ever experienced a national emergency, you would jump forward with your skills and try to help. And so informally, actually, there was a call to arms among this community saying that if there is a moment of national emergency, it is now. Actually, the history of this particular Hertz Foundation was that their founder was not that far away in relationship from the Manhattan Project, which during World War II got all of America's scientists and engineers to come together to try to win the war, actually. And so ultimately, the purpose of this fellowship was somewhat similar. If there's a moment of crisis, then all of these people who they had picked as fellows way back, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, or whatever, would try to do their part. And I was inspired because I saw what other people were doing. There were biologists in this community who were working on coming up with vaccines. There were people doing very, very advanced methods for vaccines, which I myself don't even understand. There were people using math to model things. There were mechanical engineers who were trying to figure out how to make inexpensive ventilators. It was very, very interesting. And I myself was thinking, I'm a mathematician. I actually, that day, I thought, I have nothing I can contribute. I mean, I'm going to be honest. On that day, I was thinking, wow, this guy over here in Georgia Tech, he's a professor of mechanical engineering. He's turned his research lab to go and figure out how to make ventilators. He's actually going to make a difference. Or over there, those people are doing state-of-the-art antibody research for figuring out what to do with vaccines and cures. So then I decided to go and help my graduate student and read some research paper that he was doing. This is actually my story. So I was working on the research paper to go and help give him feedback. The research paper was about graph theory, because that's actually my area of research. Graph theory is an area where you think about relationships between vertices. Actually, that's what they're called. In graph theory, you have diagrams that look like this. These are not the graphs that I've just drawn, but they are like relationship networks. You could even think of these as maybe if you talk about who is friends with who, each one of these dots is a person. And the thing about graph theory is it doesn't matter how you draw the graph. It doesn't even matter where the points are. Model for spreading. Actually, you're right. You could use math to model for spreading. And in fact, many people that I knew got involved in modeling for spreading. In fact, it was one of my colleagues, another professor at Carnegie Mellon University, who recently also had put out some very interesting articles where he actually called out that there's this issue with this flattening the curve and the idea of how are people actually modeling, where is that line? There were mathematicians thinking about this who are basically finding out that the truth is tough. I read somewhere around this time also, there was a quote where somebody said, politicians sometimes don't like math because it gives answers that you don't want to hear. So unfortunately, math is like that. In math, if you have the correct model, whatever goes in gives you a correct prediction, a pretty good prediction. And unfortunately, that's a pretty reliable prediction. So the situation is that you can indeed use math to model for spreading, and what he was working on was he was trying to alert people to the fact that the current models, the current modes of operation were actually unsustainable. And that was actually why I sprang into action, because I was worried that if we go into a situation where the entire country essentially locks down for a year, I mean, some of us will still have jobs, but I'm not sure about everyone else. And I don't even know what will happen to the American way of life or even the way of life worldwide. And that's why I decided, let's do something. I just didn't know what I could do, so I decided to go and read this graph theory paper that my PhD student had written. But as I was looking at the graph theory, it just suddenly caused me to realize, hang on a second, the graphs that we were looking at in that paper have nothing to do with real life. The point of pure mathematics is you just go and study graphs for graphs' sake, and you just try to understand how you might make algorithms in graphs, how you might try to understand graphs, and so on. So I see that there's also another point. Oh yes, so I see that somebody is responding to someone else's comment, which is very helpful. Thank you. By the way, I'm drinking a lot of water because they say that one way to try to keep as healthy as possible during this is to make sure that you don't lose your voice. So I'm doing my best here. Okay, right. But then I thought, with these abstract graphs that we've learned how to think about, I realized that actually, especially it's related to the comment we just saw about the models for spreading, the graph is fundamentally important. Because actually, let me draw a completely different picture where somehow the rate of spreading is not horrible, it's great. It's extremely slow. Let's pretend that we have a very strange country. And in this country, there's only one street. And everyone lives on this street. Now imagine that in this very strange country, since everyone lives on the same street, somehow nobody ever talks to anyone apart from who's next to them. This is sort of like social distancing, but what's more relevant is that there's this very long chain. And the way that infection works is if you get infected, it takes a few days for you to be able to infect the next person, and then it takes a few days to be able to infect the next person. What's going on is that somehow in the normal way of life in this strange country, if somebody gets infected, indeed on the first day, they're going to infect the two people next to them, because that's normal. But then on the second day, this person's still going to try to infect two people, except one of them's there, already infected. So that doesn't do anything. And that just infects this person, and this person infects that person. So we want, exactly. So Matthew has said, we want our graphs of people's interaction to be disconnected. Yes, thank you. Thank you for asking. I should probably have been much more clear about these notions of graphs because graphs are not what we usually teach in school. But this notion of a graph is where Matt used the word edges. Let me use the right word so that we can talk about this with the normal language. This edge right here, this is an edge. An edge is a connection between two vertices. Right? I called the other things vertices. That's what they're technically called. So this is called a vertex. And this is called a vertex. So in an abstract graph, we don't have to care about whether the vertices are computer servers or whether the vertices are people and what the edges mean. But when you think about it in real life, you can say, I'll model my country by saying that each of the people in my country is a vertex. And between any two vertices, which normally communicate, like in the daily life, I'll draw an edge. And so I'll draw out this graph. So if I can draw out this entire graph, then I could actually look at what's going to happen as some disease spreading starts to happen inside this country. Okay, but inside this country, as this disease spreading starts to happen, what you see is that it actually doesn't grow exponentially at all. So the question that Matt said, do we want our graphs to be disconnected? Well, it's not that necessary to be completely disconnected. What is important is that they don't expand too much. So you see, this is connected. I can actually get all the way from one end to the other if I wanted to. However, it will take a very long time for that to do so because in the rate of incubation and then being contagious and then making the next person sick and so on, it's like you're walking and walking and walking. How this is very different from the previous picture I gave. The previous picture I gave had airplanes. It had public transit. It had ways for people to go very long distances and keep mixing. So here, if everybody had some kind of helicopter and they could make two random people infected, this would also blow up exponentially. But when it happens to be a long chain like this, it won't. And so that's when I realized that graphs might have something to do with it. And so the first idea I had was, I wonder if what we do can be just to make a way to suggest to everyone what to do with their social network. That was actually my first idea. It was too complicated, by the way. But my first idea was, if only we knew everyone's social networks. If you knew your social network, you might be able to better judge whether you should be the one to go and pick up the mail or whether your friend should be the one to pick up the mail. Because you would be able to go and see, if you picked up the mail, how many more connections would you generate versus if your friend picked up the mail, how many more connections would they generate with regard to your local neighborhood, like your local connected community. But that's too complicated. I thought about that and I thought that was too complicated. Then I realized that there's another way to use this graph. You see, because right now, what we're doing as a country and as a world is we're trying to suppress the rate of infection by saying, everyone please stay at home. The R0 drops like crazy. In fact, this is a good strategy. But as this is happening, this is affecting everyone equally. Right now, I believe that's the correct thing to do, especially in a city like New York City, where there's such a large fraction of people who are sick. But this gives you a huge opportunity, because if you shut down for a few weeks, that will actually crush the R0. Because suddenly, how many people could you infect? Almost none. And it will cause the virus to burn out, so that the number of cases when you start reopening New York City is pretty low. So then the idea is, okay, crush it first. Now there are a lot fewer cases around, but at some point everyone needs to get back to work. And if everyone's starting to get back to work, what's going to happen? Well, if everyone starts going back to work, suddenly there's somebody who's infected. And then that person is going to infect the people who are connected to them on their graph. The hammer and the dance, yes! So that was a beautiful, beautiful article. There was an article on Medium. It was a very, very long article. And I feel that the person who wrote that did a very good job of articulating the same idea. It's that if you can make it so that the number of new cases and people who can infect other people reduces very low, that's the hammer. And that takes just a certain number of weeks. That will not cripple the economy. It's bad, but it will not be terrible. Yes, thank you for sharing. Thank you for sharing that particular link. If you, in that short, meaning just a few weeks period of time, reduce the number of cases, you have some hope of reopening society. But then there's a huge problem. When you reopen society, people start to infect people who are near them again. And if you look at what we had, when I went back to this picture, the basic principle is still the same. You're still going to see exponential growth start again until the fraction of people who can still be infected is sufficiently small. So the problem is that you will actually anyway have a problem where you're getting another hump, and then you suddenly need to lock down again. And that's actually where some of these articles talking about this lockdown, open up, lockdown, open up, it would be almost like this kind of a shape, which unfortunately is also not great. And that's when I started to realize you can do something. So back to this. If we actually reach a situation where suddenly we're trying to open back up again, but the number of people who are sick and who are contagious is relatively small, then that would be a good situation. If the number of people who could get people sick is small, that's good. But the question becomes, how do we very quickly identify them? And that starts to bring in what other countries have been doing, actually sometimes quite successfully, like in South Korea. And that's called contact tracing. It's called, if this person is sick, the real reason why we are having, no, I shouldn't say the real reason, one of the reasons why so many people are getting sick with coronavirus, with COVID-19, is because there are people walking around who just don't even realize that they're sick. I mean, maybe even I'm sick, I don't know. But they are able to get other people sick. With other diseases like Ebola, that's a horrible, horrible disease, but it has one tiny benefit, which is that you can't really make people sick until it's already clear you're sick. And at that point, you can try to bring these people into a place where they cannot make other people sick. Here, the issue is we cannot turn back time. So if you happen to have somebody who suddenly gets a positive test, we have no idea who they were around. And that's when I suddenly realized there's a solution. And this was 3 weeks ago on Sunday. I realized that the solution would be if only we could use the fact that everyone, almost everybody, has a mobile phone. If we use these mobile phones to use the computation and the sensors that are on the mobile phone, we could try to figure out who else has been nearby. And then, if you are actually sick, if you actually are found to be sick and found to be potentially infectious, then after you've tested positive, you go back in time and look at who else you may have met. Because somehow if you collected all of this information about who you have been around, then you would be able to alert all of those other people. Maybe you don't want to go and meet your mother or your grandmother who is potentially susceptible to having very, very hard complications from the illness. So in some other countries, the way this worked, actually, I believe I read an article saying the Israeli spy agency actually was already tracking. And at some point, they told 400 people, you need to go and quarantine yourselves, because they had already been using their devices, the normal devices that people carried in their pockets, to find out where everyone was. And some other countries used things where you would give your mobile phone number and then they would trace you and so on. There was only one problem. In the United States of America, I think it would be very hard for us to decide to do this. So somehow I didn't think it was realistic to expect that every single person in America consents to the United States federal government tracking every single person's direct whereabouts, and then having the United States government come in and tell people, you need to go and you need to go and lock up. So that was unlikely to happen. But then I realized you can actually do the whole thing anonymously. So as soon as I got this idea, I said, oh, I have an idea. The idea is very simple. It's an app, a mobile app. It's free. It's free so that it can go everywhere. Free mobile app. You install the mobile app, and as soon as you install it, it just works. In the sense that there's no username, there's no phone number, there's no email address, there's no password. In fact, you can't even find out your password. There's actually a password, but it's a random one automatically generated. And in fact, you also can't find out your username. Your username is also randomly generated. So you have all of these things which are where your phone has an identity which is made completely at random as soon as you install the app. And then as you walk around with these phones, if you happen to go within, say, 6 feet of somebody else who also has the app installed, and you spend at least half an hour with them, the apps detect each other using this thing called Bluetooth, which is what we use to connect our Bluetooth headphones. You just use Bluetooth, and you can find out whether other people are nearby. And once you know whether other people are nearby, then each of them can exchange information with each other, saying, here's my random identity. Here's my random identity. And yes, so again, thank you for asking these questions. What are the privacy concerns with this potential app, right? I mean, I'm actually a mathematician, so I care about these kinds of things. And what I realized is, if these apps are using GPS, there are major privacy issues. So by the way, there's a reason why it didn't say GPS in any of this. Because if you actually are using the GPS path, this was one technique that has been tried, to use the GPS path of where someone has been. If you're recording the GPS path, you know exactly where they live, because that's where they are at 2 a.m. on most nights, right? You would actually know where they are. So there's a major issue over there. Similarly, there are major privacy issues if you ever ask for personal information, such as email address, or even like, I don't know, even asking for your city. Like these are all things which are privacy issues. But my thought was, if all you're doing is you're exchanging these random numbers, for which the random number was what we call independently generated, meaning it actually is generated at the time of install with no correlation whatsoever with where you live, who you are, what time you installed the app, then actually everyone is unidentifiable. So just a second. So if you do this, then somehow you actually are able to build this network. And I will say that, if you actually had a huge amount of computer power, you could probably try to figure out who lives near who, in the sense that I would know that user number 632 lives near user number, actually I can't say lives near, I can just say is somehow often in contact with user number 720. But are 632 and 720 living on 14th Street and 7th Avenue? Or are they living on, I don't know my streets, but 14th Street and 3rd Avenue. We don't know, because there's no connection between this and the actual geographical location. So I will say that the privacy concerns are huge, and that's why somehow people did not build something like this. And in fact, some of the apps that came out, which asked you for your mobile phone number, that's a major privacy issue, because somehow at that point it's tied to a person. So then the idea became, can we build some app like this, which can actually sense how far away other people are? And also, for which the other piece that's important is how can you have a useful signal that goes out? For example, the signal that goes out should be somebody tested positive. And so the idea that I came up with was actually quite simple. It's not rocket science. It's just that if somebody presses a button called self-report, by the way, this is not even authenticated by a healthcare provider. This is just a self-report button, which permanently disables the app so that you're not able to self-report again. And by the way, you have to have used the app for 7 days before you can even self-report to minimize the number of these people who are just being irritating people. If you self-report, then it starts to notify people who you have been nearby. But in order to preserve privacy, what it would do is if you were using the app, you might get a message, and your message might just say, somebody just self-reported a positive test. In the last 10 days, they spent at least half an hour with you. That's the message. Do the connections fade over time? Thank you for asking. Actually, these are all very good questions. These are things that I was thinking about too. You just heard what the message was though. What I wanted to do is I wanted to make the messages that we send to be meaningful enough to a person to give them some actionable information, but to also not let them identify who this is. So for example, the message is the message is somebody just reported a positive test. Within the last 10 days, you spent at least half an hour with them. And these numbers of last 10 days, that would just be based on whatever is the current recommendation of the public health professionals of when people might be able to infect other people. And so in that sense, the connection does fade over time. It in fact disappears after 10 days, if that was the number we used. However, we don't yet know what is the optimal. And in fact, one of the goals with why I started this is because you would actually finally, if you had everyone in the world using something like this, you would actually be able to figure out what that number should be. Oh, there's another question that came. Someone's trying to think about how it would feel. Yes, how you'd feel. You see, these are great questions. This is actually why I didn't make the app myself. In fact, as soon as I got the idea, the first thing I did is I went and I recruited some really, really talented user experience designers from Carnegie Mellon University. Our university produces not only people who are quite good at technical stuff, also people very good at drama, and also it has some of the people who create the best designs, the intuitive designs that people like to use. And so what we wanted to do, and I see also a comment about testing, I'll hit that one too, but the social consequence of what would happen if you got a message saying that someone may have self-reported positive, this was actually one of the very sensitive things we tried to think about and tried to test. And what we ultimately chose to do is we chose that we would make a message that was just a fact. So I didn't want to give a prescription or a prognosis to say you're probably sick. Instead, it's just a fact. Within the last 10 days, you spent at least half an hour with this person. And indeed, of course, there's a question of how can we couch the writing to be less worrisome. But I personally would also find it useful to find out that people are coming closer. I mean, somehow that this infection is coming closer to me. There's another comment about the dearth of testing. Actually, when I was talking to after I got this idea, I started talking to some people who are very involved in actually trying to combat coronavirus. And an immediate observation that was made was, oh, if we deploy this, we can multiply the effect of the test. Because in fact, the point of the test, exactly, sooner or later somebody is saying sooner or later you might report the illness. But that's not the only case. The actual situation is that the positive tests, right now we don't have enough tests to give. But if you know that somebody is quite likely to be sick, meaning their likelihood of being sick is relatively high compared to a random person in the population, you would give them the test. If somebody has symptoms but does not get tested, we live in a free country. There's nothing we can do about that, and there's nothing I want to do about that. But the reason why I was interested in this is because of the comment I made about R0. If we just drop R0 from 2 point something to 1, or even 0.9, we're done. We don't need to drop R0 from 2.9 to 0. That's the key. The key is you don't actually need that every single person follows the behavior. But I'll tell you my behavior would change dramatically regarding whether I will meet my mother, who is not in the kind of health that would be good to get COVID-19 right now. So for example, if I saw on my signal that I had just been around someone who in the last 10 days tested positive, I would probably not go to visit my mother. I mean, I'm just simply showing that this is because maybe I care about my mother, so I wouldn't. What would a teacher with 34 students in class? This is a very, very, that's a very, very good question. What should I say about this? A teacher with 34 students in class, I mean, I'm going to say I'm not a medical professional, but one thing that I would probably do is I would probably wear a mask if I suddenly felt that there might be a chance that I might potentially infect someone. Of course, maybe we're wearing masks anyway, but it would just start to cause me to change my behavior. I want to make a very careful statement here. I'm not saying that this will drop all of the infectiousness to 0. I'm simply saying that if right now every person can infect 2.5 people on average, if we can reduce that 2.5 to say 1.2, and then we also have everyone wash their hands, which also reduces it further by another 0.1 or something, and then also if everybody wears a mask, then you drop the R0 to 1. And at that point, the disease stops to spread. So when you say a large degree of trust, it is true that if you need to drop it all the way to 0, then you need trust. If you need to say that every single person who's potentially infected immediately locks themselves in a room, that would be dropping R0 to 0, meaning that everyone who's sick gets no one sick. However, we already make progress as soon as we drop R0 from 2.5 down to 1. And so when you look at those ratios, it's like you only need to have 60% of the people play along. Does that make sense? Like I'm showing you how this mathematics is useful. Well, I'm talking about the ratio to say, I don't need a 100% effectiveness to get everybody to be in the situation where they don't transmit. I just need enough of a fraction to decide to play along that it drops the transmission rate down to where we're going to see the exponential decrease in the end. So, by the way, I'm talking about all of these things because it's, again, showing how if you use the math way of thinking through it, you can sort of see that there is a potential. It's not a full solution. But now back to the idea. It's somehow yes. So if every single person would get a message like this, or you could actually get a message that says, somebody just tested positive. Within the last 10 days, they spent at least half an hour with somebody who within the last 3 days spent at least half an hour with you. Somebody asked, don't you think that this might violate the HIPAA regulations? That was a major concern also. So at the very outset of this project, we went and checked. And so it turns out that because what we're doing here has no medical professional at all, it is completely anonymous. And in fact, when you press self-report, you can lie. What that will do is it will annoy people around you. But why I'm collecting the graph is because it's optional participation, of course. I mean, my point of this whole thing is that with this app idea, it works in a fully, like an American-style society where every single person has the right to decide to play along or not play along. On the other hand, the game we're playing is we're trying to drop a 2.5 to a 1. And so we're not trying to drop all the way to 0. That's beautiful. The observation that you don't need to go all the way to 0 shows that this is actually the kind of thing that could work. And furthermore, right now, since it's optional participation, and since we have no way of getting a healthcare professional saying so, and furthermore, there's still no tie to who you are. I mean, your ID is a random number generated on your phone. It does not violate HIPAA. HIPAA is our privacy rights for healthcare in the United States. But there's another very important aspect here. Once you have the graph, because this is what's being collected as we have all of these connection information, we actually also have a way to eventually assess whether or not somebody's self-report is bogus. So what I mean by this is that the disease actually does have a certain tendency to spread. And so you actually see disease spreading in clusters. This is where the graph theory comes in again. And so if you have the graph theory behind it, then in fact, at the beginning, you're hoping that people are being good citizens. But towards the end, if you see that there's suddenly just one case that came up and nothing else around it, maybe it's better not to just alert people around. And so this is actually how ultimately we use the graph theory to develop this kind of a procedure where you would be able to have everyone be fully anonymous, use random numbers, you'd be able to collect the graph, and then you'd use the right kind of method, the right kind of message to send, where you cannot tell who it is that you just got notified by, so the whole thing can be anonymous. And I guess the piece that clinches it on this particular part of this particular session, this session is going to have two parts. This first part is about leading up to what we're doing. The second part is some math behind like what you need in order to make it happen. That's like maybe the trigonometry and other parts inside. But this last part of the anonymous message is one where you actually can compute the anonymous message without requiring a billion computers. Somehow this can actually be done efficiently. If you have a billion people using this whole app, there are actually very efficient ways where in the course of an hour, you could actually go and process all of the new reports. I actually worked all this out. You can go and process all the new reports and alert all of the people. So that's actually the NOVID app. That's actually that's what I just released. I look quite tired because I actually was working on this for the last 3 weeks nonstop. As soon as I got the idea, I said, well, if we can overcome the human problem, the social engineering problem, to try to help people find use in this thing, then we actually could find a way to protect everybody. There's a question. Why wouldn't a person that's self-reported as infected be able to update their status if they recover? Actually, they should, but that would be a second version of the app. To me, what I felt was the main experiment that had to be tested was, is it possible to make an app that the average citizen in an America-like culture, America-like society, feels is useful and wants to install? And if so, if we have this thing, we can keep adding more and more and more features as we go. At the beginning, what we need to protect against is people who are falsely self-reporting, so you make it hard to do that. Towards the end, when you have a very strong understanding of the relationship structure, a false report is useless because the graph algorithm finds out that it's not the case. What are the degrees of separation notified if someone tests positive? The algorithm that we planned out right now only tells 3 degrees. Somehow, and actually somebody also pointed out they're out of the pool. They do not need to be in the app. To be perfectly honest, if you can tell the rate at which I was running to make this project was directly related to the fact that we don't, as a society, have time to go and make the perfect, beautiful solution. We right now need to get everything back rolling again. So the number one priority was, can we make it so that at the moment when our country starts to go back outside, we at least have something that every American actually finds that they might want. And in fact, they install it, they immediately adjust their own behavior without having the police tell them. As long as enough fraction of people affect their own behavior and the rest and everyone washes their hands and wears masks, we drop our R0 below 1 and we suddenly are able to get back to life. The main observation was once you go to the graph, you no longer need to keep everyone and treat them all exactly the same. The whole game becomes, is there a way to passively figure out who has been with who in a completely anonymous way? When is the iOS version coming out? Actually, this is now talking about the practicalities. I'll say a bit about practicalities, and then I want to talk about math. So the practicalities, when will the iOS version come out? We released the Android version first because the way that Android works, it allows you to post something online. You can post the entire file online in advance. And when you do so, anyone can download it. There's no restriction. That person just gets a warning saying maybe it's untrusted. But at least I can distribute it, and at least we can find out whether the world wants it. The Apple Store, on the other hand, is very different. You cannot do that. And unfortunately, in order to protect people, actually not unfortunately, fortunately, in order to protect people, you cannot anyhow make an app about COVID and put it on the Apple Store. So what I did is we first made the Android one. We're observing, actually right now we're observing that there's a lot of interest in seeing this happen and this scale up. At that point, what I'm actively trying to do is I'm trying to reach out to the people at the Apple App Store to get a confirmation that if we make the same app for that we made for the Google, that they will let us put it up. If they let us put it up, we will go full speed ahead. We already wrote half of the app. So actually, this whole project has been one of where every single day I just look at how many people are unfortunately losing their lives, and we just have to get this done, So the situation is I just shared this first over my social network to go and see, is there anyone I know? And actually, I'm already getting somewhat closer to talking to those people. Second question was, how do you get everyone to install it? Well, to be perfectly honest, you don't need everyone to install it. That was the other main observation. It's graph theory. If you install it, and if you ask the people around you to install it or encourage the people around you to install it, you don't need to care whether the people in Montana have it. You don't need to care whether the people in Florida have it. You don't even need to care whether the people in Connecticut have it. Well, maybe you do, depends on where you live in New York City. But the point is, it's all local. So as long as I install it and the people that I'm around install it, I've made a shield, like a bubble around myself, so that the moment the virus starts to get close to my shield, I have a warning that says, hey, I'm now only 3 steps away from the virus. Maybe I should adjust my behavior. So the way I think of this is it's almost like a radar. That's actually why I would like to have the app myself. It's that if I have it and people around it, then we would actually know as soon as somebody's coming close. And because of that local nature, that you only need the people around you, that causes the app to be able to be useful even before it spreads everywhere. Also, it makes it so that if somebody installs it, they start asking the people around them to install it. And then it just spreads. So actually what we're doing is we're trying to combat a virus with a viral app. It's the same principle. We just need that our app's R0 is bigger than the COVID-19 R0. And ultimately, that's what we're trying to do. There was a question of how many people are working on the app and who are they? So to be perfectly honest, I do want to get back to math, so we'll do that soon. But I'll just hit this one last question about the app itself, and then I want to go to math because that's what we were supposed to talk about. But how many people were working on the app? So there were about 14 people who rallied very quickly to do this. As soon as I got the idea, I actually posted it on my Facebook and said, I have this idea, and I'm looking for this kind of talent. Like I named it a certain type of talent. And people came out of the woodwork who were maybe former students of mine at Carnegie Mellon University or former friends. And these are people who may be working in Silicon Valley or maybe are current students at Carnegie Mellon who are just graduating and so on. What's the name of the app? You can't find it on the Play Store yet because we're still in discussion. The app is called NOVID, N-O-V-I-D. Right, it's like COVID with an N. But the people that came around were ultimately whoever I could find to come together to go and do this. And so we did this. Ultimately, I myself ended up being one of the main programmers of the app because my background also includes programming. So I actually was the one who built the part that senses how far away other people are. And in fact, that's what we're going to talk about in the second half of this talk. So that's roughly what I wanted to say about this app. I do hope that it contributes positively to society, but in any case, there's also a lot of math underneath, which I want to hit. So we usually take a break about halfway through. It has been about halfway through. So what I'll do is I'd like to say maybe we'll continue talking again at about 5:50 p.m., which is in about 9 minutes. That'll give me some time to drink water and also check the camera that we're using. And we'll start again at 5:50 p.m. Wait a second, is it 5:50? I think my clock must be off. I don't know what time it is. Just a second. So is it actually 6? It should be stopping at 6:50. 6:50. So something is wrong with the clock that I have that's on the computer. I'm off by 1 hour. So we'll continue again at 6:50. I'll take a drink of water as well. And then we'll continue. And what I want to talk about next is actually some of the math that's underneath and something that you can tell your students, especially if you're teaching trigonometry, of how this app that maybe we will eventually start using or other apps that are similar are actually using trigonometry. Okay, I'll be back. I'm going to get some water. Hello. So I just got back. I'm just looking at the comments just to catch up. Ah, okay. Wow. Well, thank you very much for your comments. I mean, I'll say actually, it's just an honor for me to be able to talk about the math behind this, to an audience for whom I guess we think about math all the time. In some sense, my goal with this is also to talk about the math in a way where we're talking about lots of different levels of math, so that whatever students you're teaching, they can actually see that if you think about the entire crisis from the point of view of a mathematician, or even from the point of view of understanding the math that you're teaching them, then they actually will have a much better life. In fact, one of the points that I brought up is that some of these math things I'm using are pretty simple. However, the goal is that if you just use those simple things, you can actually get insight that maybe you aren't finding out from the news, or aren't finding out from anyone because they don't know. Now that brings into the next part, which is where we're going to talk about maybe some of the more sophisticated part of math. And this is where I also think it's actually quite fun. So now the heart of all of this is there's a math part, right? It's like, yes, okay, great. I just talked about app. Yeah, go and make an app. It sounds good. Everyone can make an app, right? Actually, it's harder than it sounds. I learned the hard way. It's harder than it sounds. When I got the idea of making an app, I said, oh, we'll be done in 3 days. That wasn't true. It took 3 weeks. On the other hand, there's something that's very fundamental, which is called, can you sense distance? So the heart of this whole thing becomes, I have a device. How far away is the other device? The techniques that almost all of the other apps were using were either GPS, which I felt was not okay from a privacy perspective, and also GPS is not sufficiently accurate. The United States military has very accurate GPS, but civilian GPS cannot detect you within a few meters, and that's on purpose. On the other hand, most people who were doing this kind of app before were using something called Bluetooth, the thing you use to connect your headset or a keyboard or whatever. And what they were doing is they were measuring what is in the industry is called the relative signal strength indicator. So if something else is broadcasting a signal to you, you can find out how much power it was broadcasting at, and then you can find out how weak the signal you got was. There's an inverse squared law, and so you can figure out, how far away you are. And that works as long as both of your phones are on the table, are in open air. The problem is that I usually carry my phone in my pocket. There are some people who carry their phone in their handbag. All of these things can cause that signal to not be accurate anymore. In fact, some of these apps which said use the Bluetooth and just use the Bluetooth, the way that they operated was that under ideal conditions, if you just put the phone out on the table, it's perfect. But then how do you deal with all the other situations? It's sort of like how if somebody makes a noise, if I just use how loud they are to estimate how far away they are, that works until they're shouting at me from underneath a blanket and I am under another blanket. So there's something else you can use. You can use both light and sound at the same time. So I said light because Bluetooth is using radio waves. Radio waves are things that move at the speed of light. And the speed of light is 300 million. Actually, I probably should have written it in a different way, but somehow this is not scientific notation. This is just how I think of it. 300 million meters per second. I think. Maybe I'm wrong. I think that's right. So 300 million meters per second. Somebody said, couldn't you use the movement accelerometer data to compare changes in signal strength? Yes, maybe. But my worry is that the more different sensors you use, the more likely it becomes that one of them is bogus. Actually, unfortunately, a lot of devices, especially Android devices, are made by all kinds of different manufacturers, and you actually don't have a strong control. This is something I learned the hard way. In fact, I'll say, you were asking what the team was like making this. Oh, thank you. That's correct for the speed of light. That must mean I have a physics teacher in the room. Thank you so much. But so, I don't have much of a budget, right? So what I did is I went to the local cell phone repair store, and I asked the guy who ran the store, do you have any broken phones? That's actually how I got my Android phone supply and my iPhone supply. I went to the store that fixes cracked screens, and sometimes they get phones that just aren't working anymore and they're basically trash. But what they can do is, as they can't make phone calls, but they have the Bluetooth transmitter, and they also have all the other sensors on the phone. So that's the speed of light. And so, yes, the other sensors just aren't good enough for you to get that kind of information. And anyway, you would have trouble finding out if it was in a purse or a handbag. But there's something else. There's the speed of sound. Now, I learned that the speed of sound is not a constant. It's not so simple. It depends on the temperature. It depends on the humidity. I'll say it's approximately to two significant figures, 340 meters per second. Sometimes somehow the standard somehow is 343 in certain conditions, like maybe room temperature and normal humidity, but I'll just say around 340. The important thing here is that extra 10 to the power 6. And so because there's a difference in speeds, this becomes a distance, rate, and time problem that actually you can give to Algebra 1 students. The point is, if you are watching a football game and you see a kickoff, you see the ball get kicked, and then a little while later you hear the thud. Similarly, if you see lightning strike, you see the flash, and a certain time later you count 1, 1,000, 2, 1,000, 3, 1,000. You figure out that's when the sound hits you, and then you figure out exactly how far away the lightning struck. Right? This is a standard distance, rate, and time problem with relative speeds. Except that because one of the speeds is 10 to the power 6 times as fast as the other, it's actually insignificant. So the whole thing just becomes the Bluetooth you can use to facilitate an instant communication. Instant communication is like me signaling to the other phone, hey, I'm about to send you some information. Meanwhile, the other phone, I can say, I'm sending you information, and I also broadcast the sound at the same time. And the other phone, they get the information instantly because of the speed of sound. So not instantly, but this is very fast. And the speed of sound makes it go across in some pokey way. And in particular, if they happen to be 1 meter away, it takes like 1 meter away. If it's 340 meters per second, then it would take. Oh, this is hard for me. this kind of like calculations, but it's like 0.1. I was like, for me, like every millisecond was about a foot. So like 0.3 milliseconds. There we go. Is that right? 1 meter. 1 meter should be yeah. That's right. 1 meter is about 0.3 milliseconds, I think, because if I have 0.3 milliseconds times this speed, then I get approximately 1 meter. So. Sorry, not 0.3, 3 milliseconds. Like basically every millisecond is approximately 1 foot, and 3 milliseconds is going to be approximately 3 feet, which is approximately 1 meter. And 3 milliseconds is 3 over 1,000, and 3 over 1,000 times this is approximately 1. Yeah. So the point is, you actually just need to measure how far away that sound went. So then it becomes very simple. All you need to do is have these phones, which are in people's pockets, making noises to each other. So the Bluetooth is something that's sent at the speed of light. It's a signal. It's just a signal that is going over saying, I'm about to do X, Y, Z. And then the sound is also broadcast. But there's another fundamental problem. So I'm not going to do the calculation here to figure out like to work out like the formula. That one everyone can do. In fact, it could be a fun exercise for your students. They would also use it to figure out how to find out how far away thunder was. But now the hard part becomes, what sound do you want to play? The Bluetooth signal doesn't bother anyone. It's a radio wave, and it's always making radio waves. You don't notice. But if you're walking around in your pocket and your phone is like playing jingle bells all the time, it's just not reasonable. So it turns out that there's something called ultrasound. So human beings listen to sound at certain frequencies. So the range of sound that most adults can hear up to is like somehow human hearing is up to about. So it's about 17 kilohertz or 18 kilohertz. My personal hearing is only up to about 16 to 17 kilohertz. We have somebody that I was working with to build this app. He's younger, and he actually could hear these 17 kilohertz signals. What does kilohertz mean? Kilohertz is in cycles per second. So what a kilohertz signal means is that actually a sound wave is sort of like is a vibration. And if I'm measuring like when the vibration goes back and forth, if I measure how much my displacement is, being the plus or the minus displacement over time, if I wiggle at 17 kilohertz, that level of displacement is what makes that particular sound. For example, if I make a wiggle at 1 kilohertz, will dogs freak out about the sound? We tested that. We actually were quite curious. Apparently, dogs looked at it and they were curious. But it was somehow they were curious. It wasn't that they freaked out about the sound. Also, because of this, we made it so that the sound pulses were shorter. So we're making the sound, actually, this is a continual this is a work in progress, where we're making the sounds shorter, and we're also adjusting, we're going to be adjusting what frequencies we're playing the sounds at. But I want to talk about like what does trigonometry have to do with all of these frequencies. And yes, the dogs freaking out was what we checked on day 1. We were actually quite curious about what this might do. Okay, but then as we go here, it's like, what does 17 kilohertz mean? It means that in the period of 1 second, if that's time, this is a time axis. There's something else. This is the displacement axis. And what displacement means is it means that you should imagine that there's a particle that's wiggling back and forth. In fact, that eventually that might be your eardrum. It's wiggling back and forth, and it's going to wiggle up and down. The 17 kilohertz, kilo means 1,000, so it's 17,000 something, and a hertz is a cycle every second. And so if you have a perfect sine wave, that's actually what they're called. If you have a perfect sine wave, that's supposed to be like the sine function, sine x. And you have the sine wave, which happens to make 17,000 cycles in 1 second, which is not what I drew because I can't possibly, I wouldn't have been able to draw it good enough, draw it accurate enough to make 17,000 of them in a graph that you could watch on the screen. On the other hand, you should imagine that this 1 second, oh, I know what I can do. I can cheat. I can write a dot, dot, dot in between. So the dot, dot, dot is supposed to represent that I kind of broke my axis. Okay? Meanwhile, I see some questions which are coming. First of all, let me emphasize, this 17 kilohertz means it makes 17,000 cycles in 1 second. So this thing made 17,000 cycles. Cycles are like this in that period of 1 second. That's a sine wave of frequency 17 kilohertz. Now I see some questions. So what about other animals that rely on ultrasound, like bats? Yes. So if you happen to go into a cave and I should also say our thing only makes this pulse every 5 minutes. And it makes this pulse every 5 minutes for about a second, actually a fraction of a second. So in that sense, you wouldn't get too much in the way of the bats, I think. But unfortunately, we unfortunately can't have everything. And you're right, we are actually already disturbing insect activity with our night lights. In fact, we're disturbing all the rest of life anyway with our activities. So of course we want to minimize our impact if possible. But I'll say that in this particular case, the question just became, what do we have available to us? And so ultimately the question was, what works on a device that you're carrying in your pocket anyway? Because in this device, I only have certain sensors. And fortunately, there's a sound, there's a speaker, and also there's a receiver. There's also the microphone. So we can use both. But now the question becomes, how do you tell apart where the sound is? How do you tell whether or not the sound was played? You see, because if I have this 17 kilohertz signal, actually it's related to the fact that the sounds are out there already. There's a lot of background noise. The question is, how is battery life affected by continuously generating sound? The good news is that a lot of people play music all the time anyway. And in fact, the battery can last for hours with that. But remember, ours is playing, if you're sensing in a low number of people environment, it would be playing once every 5 minutes for about a second. So we chose this thing so that it wouldn't hit the battery life. And you can also make your time units. Oh yes, thank you. Actually, Vera, you have a good point. If I did all my time units in milliseconds, that would actually be a lot easier because I would only have to make 17 of these cycles. One moment, please. Okay, so the next thing I want to talk about is, how do you know if this sound happened? So this happens to be a sine wave. And the situation is that there's a lot of other sounds in the environment. So if all you saw was this kind of a sound wave, in fact, actually what we would see if we were in a perfectly quiet environment and somebody starts playing a pulse of sound, what we would see is a function where the function starts basically 0 and then suddenly it starts to do this. So this thing we can see, you can see it off the top of your head like this without having to try anything. On the other hand, if it happens to have a lot of background sound, the way that sound works is that the waves add. Basically, as a math teacher, we just add the functions, right? So if you go and play a bunch of different sound waves on top of each other, then they just all add together and they start to interfere and cancel. When you add something that's positive with something that's negative, they just cancel. They work against each other. You might not get 0, but they cancel against each other. And so the question becomes, if you are actually not seeing something this pretty, but if instead you see something that you just don't know. And of course, it won't look like this. It would look worse. But there's something which is just somehow a big mess of different frequencies. What's going on? How do you figure it out? This is where trigonometry comes in. So I'm just going to do an example which shows why sines and cosines are so interesting. So the first is that these are sine waves. And so if I wanted to write a sine wave, at this point, I'm not going to worry about the units. I apologize to the physics teachers out here. Somehow, the units we can always work out later. I just want to show you why something interesting happens when you start to use these different frequencies, the sine function. So I'm going to draw a graph, and this particular graph here is going to be just f of x equals sine x. I'm going to keep my life really simple. I'll just do a few very, very simple examples. If this is f of x equals sine x, looks like this. Okay? So that happens to be f of x equals sine x. And suppose what I have is that hurts. You guys are great. So suppose this is f of x equals sine x. And suppose I have another function, which I'm also looking at. Maybe it's f of x equals sine of 2x. Except I want to make that I want a different coefficient on that sine of 2x. Well, do I want to do that or not? No, I think it's fine. So I'll have just this f of x equals sine x. And I'll have another function, which I'll also draw, which is f of x equals sine of 2x. Actually, I shouldn't call it f. Let's call it g. So sine 2x, the 2 and the x are together, of course, the way that we usually write it. Wait, is that actually how we write it? I already forgot how people usually write these things when we're teaching in school. Do we actually write sine 2x, or do you write parentheses? Because actually I've been programming so much, I've been writing parentheses. So I think I'll write parentheses just in case, but it's been a while since, I think we don't write parentheses in class. Is that right? I vaguely remember that in class we don't write parentheses, but don't quote me on that. Either way. But I've been actually writing code for the last few weeks, so I've been putting parentheses on all my things. Okay, great. So it's sine 2x. Now I need to draw sine 2x. Sine 2x is going to make 2 cycles. Oh yeah, there's some units. The units here, I'm just going to use the units of radians. It doesn't actually matter, but I'll say that this happens at 2 pi. Okay? And then this is going to be at 2 pi radians. Is that okay? So there's 2 pi radians, and sine 2x is going to do this. Okay. I'm sorry that my freehand sign is not very good. Now, suppose that I have a goal. Suppose my goal is something simpler at the beginning, where it's not that I have a big messy frequency, but I want to know what I heard. Is it this frequency, sine x frequency, or is it the double frequency, sine 2x? Parentheses dependent on whether you're emphasizing that it's a function. Oh, thank you. And indeed, I guess that shows that I've been stuck in a situation where I've had to emphasize their functions to the Java programming language that we're using in Android. But okay, so we have this thing and we have this thing over here. And the game becomes, how could I identify which of those is playing? And there's something that's really, really interesting that you can do. It happens to be related to an integral. So the integral is what happens if you find the area under a function. That's all I'll have to say about it. We don't actually need to use any calculus to observe something really interesting happening. Okay? So if I wanted to detect which of these I just heard, because that's actually fundamental to what we are doing. We're doing something where you're eventually going to have many of these layered on top of each other. I'll be able to explain how that works too. But over here, if I want to detect, let's suppose life is simple. I either get this or I get that. How do I detect whether it's this one? Well, watch this. If I take my input f of x, and if I try to figure out what happens when I calculate f of x times sine x, I'm just going to do this, and I'll draw a new graph. Here I'm just going to kind of freehand it. The important thing is to get an idea of what it looks like. What does f of x times sine x look like? So suppose that my microphone has measured this signal, and it just happens to be this. Although I don't know beforehand that it's so nice, my rule is just I want to take f of x times sine x, and I want to graph that. And then I want to find the area underneath it. How do you graph that? Well, to graph that, f of x times sine x, it's already sine x, so I just need to square, sine squared. Sine squared will make it so that it's always positive. So over here there's a pi. And if I just wanted to freehand what it might look like, well, the maximum here is 1. And so the maximum at the, it's going to be 0 here, because if I take f of x times sine x, I have 0 times 0. Over here I get 1 times 1, so it'll be up to the hump. And then the question becomes, how does it look in the hump? I don't exactly know. Actually, my gut is it does this. My gut is it does this. So in that case, this is actually the wrong. It actually should probably look a little bit like a parabola. Let me try to draw that again. Unfortunately, I can actually draw there. Great. By the way, I'm going to tell you why I guessed that it looks like a parabola. It's because when sine x is close to 0, sine x is very close to the function x. So if you imagine you zoomed in on the graphing calculator of sine x and got into the window, which is like minus point, oh, it's not parabolic. Maybe I'm wrong then. Wait a second. So the sine x, if you zoom in really, really close to 0, and you're looking at the window from minus 0.1 to 0.1, sine x is approximately a line. It's approximately x, which means that if I multiply it by itself, I should get approximately x squared. So you're right that it's not parabolic. Maybe I used the wrong word. I don't want to use that it's exactly a parabola, but I think that when you're really, really close to 0, it looks very close to a parabola. And that's because sine x behaves very similarly to just x, I think. Again, it's always possible that I'm wrong, but I have a feeling this is correct. So, what do we have here? So I have to look. So 0.5 sine 2x plus 0.5. Oh, just a second. I want f of x times sine x. I want these. I'm taking f of x times sine x, and later I'm going to do g of x times sine x. I want to compare those. So I'm not multiplying yet the across. So I'm not exactly sure I understand Eric's comment yet. 0.5 sine 2x plus 0.5. Oh, I think you're saying, yes, I understand. I understand what you're saying. You're using the double angle identity. I agree with you. So you're saying that it is sine 2x and then plus 1 over 2. I think I'm still having a little bit of trouble because I would imagine that when x equals 0, you need to get an answer of 0. So yeah, when x equals 0, I think you should get 0. Maybe it could be that I just don't quite understand what you're writing. That's the most likely outcome. But it actually is not really important what it looks like. What's more important is that it's always above the axis. So that's important. Because then if I had some way, oh no, don't be sorry, it's okay. Actually, the reason I stopped is because I make mistakes all the time. Actually, for me, whenever I do anything, yes. Now that looks like it. I'm not sure I believe that one yet either. I think you have a minus sign that you need to add, because I'm testing what happens if you put an x equals 0. And when x equals 0, cosine is 1. And so my gut feeling is that you need a minus 1/2. But again, as I said, I myself am always prone to making these kinds of addition mistakes or sign errors or whatever. What matters is the meaning, and then we can always figure it out as we go. So here we have everything which is above the x-axis. That has a very important point, because by the way, your sound wave is not only coming for one period. You have no idea. You might actually have heard many, many periods of sound waves. And if that's the case, if it just keeps on going and you did this, you get something quite miraculous, that it always stays above the axis. What that means is, if you figured out the area under that curve, that would be a positive number. And not just a positive number, you'd pick up a good chunk of area every pi. That's very, very important. And if you're wondering, yes, so the integral is always positive, but not only positive. The integral, you can estimate how big it is. Actually, if you are a calculus teacher, you can in fact even figure out if f of x was not just sine x, if f of x was like 15 times sine x, when you calculate the integral, okay, that's what we are actually doing. So I'll actually put that symbol down. When you calculate an integral, I actually want a definite integral, but I don't know from where to where. It's basically like 0 to, let's call it the end of the signal. I've been programming so much that I now write multiple letter things that says end, but I just don't know what I'll use for a letter okay, let's use capital T. Capital T is going to mean that somehow the signal ended at T. Okay, and imagine that we got like a number of cycles, which is all the way there. T is here. So I'm basically saying I'm calculating this integral, and it's not only always positive, it's actually always positive and predictable. Because if I had f of x, which wasn't sine x, but if f of x was like 50 sine x, the answer would be 50 times as big. So actually, when you take a function like this, which happens to be sine x or some multiple of sine x, if you integrate it against, oh wow, I used that word already. If you integrate it against sine x, meaning I take my f, whatever that signal is, multiply by sine x, I forgot my dx. If I do this, then I will be able to estimate exactly what was the amplitude of the first sine x. Did that sort of make sense? I'm saying that if I didn't know what was the amplitude, unknown amplitude, like 5, if it was a 5 sine x, I could use this integral, this area underneath all these bumps, to figure out that it was 5. Because I would figure out what this area under the curve, how that compares to the area under what would happen if I just fed in a normal sine x. So that's a very interesting observation. Practically speaking, this integral is very easy to do. If you're a calculus teacher, we use Riemann sums. In fact, the way a computer or a smartphone stores sound files is just like Riemann sums. So yeah, thank you very much. It's a scalar multiple. And indeed, Eric, this is why there's some relationship between what I'm talking about now and the original topic of the class, which was about matrices. In fact, what we're doing here is a linear function in the sense that whatever, whatever I put in as my signal f, if I integrate f of x times sine x dx, it's linear in the signal that I put in. If I put in a different signal, which is like 5 times as big as the original signal, my answer becomes 5 times as much. And also, if I put in the sum of two signals, my integral is the sum of the two. We'll get there soon. Okay, anyway, this thing helps me to detect what is the amplitude. But what happens if my signal was g, and I take my signal that came in, it was g of x, and I try to integrate it against sine x? Don't worry if you aren't teaching calculus. We don't need calculus to think about this. You only need algebra 2. So what happens if I take my g of x, which was sine of 2x, and if I calculate what happens with g of x times sine of x? Notice I'm still using the sine of x because it's going to turn out that when I multiply by sine x and I do this thing called the integral, if I find the area underneath, that helps me to detect whether or not the signal that came in had that sine x wave in it. Watch. Because if I do this, what is this actually? So as a function, if I want to graph this, that might not be so nice to graph. So what is that to graph? I don't know. Horrible. But it's sine 2x times sine x. Okay. So now what does that look like if I try to graph it? At this point, actually, if you're teaching a class, it doesn't hurt to go and grab Desmos. That's not a bad thing. But is there any other way to do this? Do I have any pre-calculus or algebra 2 teachers here? We have a product of two different signs. This is like, there's some identities, right? If I have sine A, sine B, is there something I can do? It's actually been a while since I thought about this stuff myself. Is anyone able to put something here? Okay, you are right that I can use the 2 sine squared cosine x. I can do that, but that's not actually exactly what I wanted. I wanted to use like, is there some kind of an identity about sine A, sine B? Okay, we're going to go take some scratch work here. Is there anything about sine A, sine B? These are these product to sum things. And I will say, when I learned product to sum identities a long time ago, I remember thinking, when are you ever going to use this? So what is this? Actually, can anyone help me? Is there a way to use a product to sum? Do I have enough teachers here? Thank you. I knew that by giving this talk to teachers, you guys would save me. So there's this thing. Okay, so this is 1/2. Somebody says it's 1/2, and we'll check it, okay? It's cosine A minus B minus cosine A plus B. Okay. So now, the way I always think about this is, can I double check this? For me, I always found it easier in my life to double check it by starting from this mess on the right-hand side and converting it into the left-hand side. Because for whatever reason, the cosine difference formula, that one I can do. Amy is correct. Thank you, Amy. Amy, yes, that was Amy, right? Yes, thank you, Amy. Really, really, really helpful to have you here. But yeah, I mean, these things are things that we derive, we prove, and usually it just becomes something that you memorize and whatever. But if I wanted to double check this, I'll just say this is how I usually did it when I was a student. Cosine A minus B, that's cosine A, cosine B, plus sine A, sine B. That was this part. And that's good because now I see there's going to be cancellation. I want to subtract out. This is going to be cosine, wait a second. Yes, it's cosine A, cosine B minus sine A, sine B. And so indeed, if you do this, you cancel out the front terms. Yes, those two front terms, and what's left is 2 sine A sine B with a half. It works. Why did I do this? The reason I did this is because although it's true that you can use those double angle identities, this is going to be much more useful for me to show that something neat happens. What happens if I use it there? Well, over here, now I get 1/2. And I will get cosine of A minus B, which is just x, minus cosine of, I have 2x plus x, which is 3x. Okay, now what happens if I try to find the area under that curve as I keep going? I'm using something called linearity. I'm about to use something called linearity. I could graph this with Desmos and it would look kind of wiggly. Okay? But if I want to find the area under this, it's the same as finding the area under half cos x and then adding the area under minus half cos 3x. When I say area under, my area under can be a negative number. So if I actually have a wave that's doing this, once I go under, I will subtract that amount. Okay? So the important thing is when I have something like this, if you start integrating over a long enough period, meaning if you go for a long enough window that you're going to make this signal along, okay? If you have a long enough window, then when you look at the area under this, it's the sum of those two areas. So this is this integral sign, but you can always just think about it as areas. So thank you for also sharing the graph, Amy. I appreciate that. It's nice for people to see. It's not a nice thing. If you try to graph cos x minus cos 3x, oh, I mean, it looks beautiful, but it's not like a nice thing to calculate the area under. But my point is, the area under it is actually a really nice number. Because if what I try to do is I try to find the area under, okay, whenever I draw this squiggle 0t, that's an integral. It just means the area underneath. If I take the area underneath 1/2 cosine x dx, and then when you find the area underneath something, if you were to add or subtract your functions that you're finding area under, it's just the same as adding and subtracting the areas of for each of the functions. So I can write this. Area under 0 to t, 1/2 cosine 3x dx. Are people still with me? I mean, the thing that I don't like is I don't like drawing notation if I can avoid it. But here, if I wrote the word area under, that might just be too much. So if I have this area under and this area under, when t is really, really big, what do I get? This is very nice. If t is really, really big, then compared to t, it's actually close to 0. You see, because the cosine x is wiggling. Up, down, up, down, up, down, up, down. And it always goes as much down as it goes up. So as the t is large, when you compare it to t, this doesn't grow much. In comparison, over here, if my t gets big with the integral against sine x, multiplying it against sine x and taking the area under, I get something that grows with t. It's linear in t. And over here, I get something that's only constant. I mean, in some sense, if I'm so lucky as to have a t, which is a perfect ending of those periods, it's even 0 minus 0. So the important thing is that this particular integral, this answer, does not grow with t. At this moment, I actually want to switch the recording card that's in my camera. If you don't mind, it will take me approximately 30 seconds. I want to switch the card because this is a good point. Thank you for waiting. Thank you for waiting. I actually am recording everything that I do, so that way, in case any time we want to use it again, we can. So over here, what we just found out is that if you go and take your function, the signal that we got, if the signal happened to be sine 2x, and if you multiply that signal against sine x, like multiply means for every value of x, multiply the functions, calculate the areas underneath them, you get 0, or close to 0, meaning as the t gets bigger and bigger, it's close to 0. You can actually just divide by t if you want, and if you divide by t, this thing tends to a limit of 0 as you divide by t, and t gets bigger. On the other hand, this one, if you divide by t, and you take a limit as t gets bigger, this approaches just a constant. It's whatever fraction that should be, because it's scaling. Okay, so we have just found a way to figure out whether that frequency is playing or that frequency is playing. This is actually the beginnings of what's called Fourier analysis. So that was actually at the heart of what we have to do with our ultrasound. Fourier analysis. Fourier analysis is based on this great idea that actually every signal can be decomposed into sines of different frequency, actually sines and cosines of different frequencies. And you can actually figure out, you can notice that if something happens to be at a particular frequency, if you're picking out a particular frequency, you can do this thing called integrating, multiplying the function by that sine, sin, and then you will get something. With some exceptions. There's also a situation where if the signal you got is just a pure cosine, then you actually need to multiply by cosine instead. But that's a separate piece. Instead, what I want to do to close up this thing is just to say, that's why I wanted to do this way, instead of talking about the double angle formula. Because what I just wrote here works, even if it's not 2x. If it happens to be 4x, or let's just choose 5x. 5 is a weird number. If it was 5x, sine 5x. If I had a sine 5x frequency, that would correspond to a frequency that was wiggling 5 times as fast. In terms of hertz, that would be 5 times as high in the frequency. Yes, the frequency would be 5 times as high. Then over here, this wouldn't be 2x. This would be 5x. And the product to sum relation is very useful, because sine 5x times sine x, now I take the a minus b, so that's going to be cos 4x. And then I have a minus. Over there, it's the a plus b, so that would be 6x. And now if I have just this pure half cos 4x minus half cos 6x, if I go and find out the area underneath as I look at a window from 0 to some big T, then indeed, that's again going to be the same kind of picture as here. Effectively, what we're using is that when I have cosine as just a cosine standing alone, if you take the cosine, it's just going to do this. So as you make your time go on, you keep canceling as much up as you get down, and it cancels away. It's actually at this point that you can see that's why something weird happens that's very special when it's not sine 5x, but when it's sine just x. So back to the original one. What if we use product to sum with the original sine x times sine x? That was f. If you use normal product to sum with just sine x, now what happens is you get a minus b. Aha, cosine a minus b is cosine 0x. And on the other hand, I get the a plus b, so x plus x, that's 2x. If I look at the area under this, that half cos 2x part, that's still going to be like 0, but it's the cos 0. Cosine of 0 is 1. And that's actually why, if I go and take the area under this, in fact, if I take the area under this, I already now know what the area is. Because if I took the area over an interval, the cos 2x part wouldn't add anything. But the cos 0 is 1. So I'm basically picking up half the entire time. And indeed, actually, one of our teachers had given us this formula. It was something like cos squared, or cos 2x. Or maybe you were doing something with the 1 and the cos 2x and the 1/2. That's actually what we have here. Like we actually just got that here. And so that's showing that somehow the function was wiggling up and down over a half. Okay, so at this point, the purpose of this Fourier analysis is that way you can actually have the phones communicating with each other on specific frequencies. And those frequencies are not heard by people. There can be all the background noise you want because of what I just said about how things are linear. Because if what you end up having is you end up having a weird signal. If what you got is a signal which was hx, let me write it more neatly. If you got a signal which was hx equals sine 2x plus sine 3x, and of course I could use cosines too if I want to get more things. Oh yes, thank you. Cos 2x, thanks Aziz. Cos 2x is 1 minus 2 sine squared, 2 sine squared x, yes. And then over here, if I got this signal instead, look, if I do the same trick of, it's called an integral, but I just multiply it by sine x. Because the integral is linear, meaning that when I put these different functions in, if I'm going to add the functions first and then integrate, this is going to give me the same answer as if I integrate first and then add. But if I did it slowly, I will get that it's the area under if I had sine 2x plus sine 3x times sine x dx. And again, this is like what you would see in a calculus class, but you don't need calculus to think about this. This is two functions which are added together and finding the area under. And so that's just the area under 0 to t. The first product, sine 2x, sine x, dx. And the second product, the area under the second product, sine 3x, sine x, dx. And both of those are, okay, not really 0, because it depends on whether t is a perfect multiple of your period. But I'll write about 0 compared to t. Yeah, thank you very much, Isabella. It's basically 0. It's like if my t was unlucky, I might get something there. But as my t gets bigger and bigger, it's close to 0. This about 0 just means with respect, like in relation to t. But this is very powerful. What this says is that, for example, if I want to know whether any signal has a frequency inside it, contains a frequency inside it, which was one of these perfect like sine x waves, I just need to integrate it against the sine x and find out. That's actually how our devices are talking to each other. They're sending perfect sine waves, and they're telling each other, hey, did you hear this particular sine wave? Of course, this is just the version 1 of it. The point was, is it possible to make such a thing happen? And the answer was yes, it's actually possible to make such a thing happen. In order to make it more robust, we actually do more stuff than what I just told you. However, this is the basic principle is actually the product of sum identity. And in fact, every sound wave in the world can be broken apart into different frequencies. This thing is called the Fourier transform. And the fact that you can do such a thing is how sometimes if you look at like, it's called a spectrum equalizer. If you have some kind of audio equipment, it will sometimes tell you, here's how much low frequency sound you have, here's how much mid-range, here's how much treble, like bass, mid-range, treble. It's all using this. It's actually just taking whatever sound came in from that device, whether it's playing it from the CD. Oh gosh, I don't know if people still play CDs, but that just shows how like what I was used to thinking about. But anyway, it's like if you have this device which is playing, it will tell you, how much of each frequency you have, basically by doing something like this. So ultimately, what was this talk about? So this talk was to maybe talk about all the different kinds of ways that mathematics, to me, came in handy as I was just thinking about what to do with the COVID-19 pandemic. I mean, the story started out with something very simple. We the olds, we have CDs. I still have CDs actually, but I'll say I still I respect the people who have vinyl. I'm not actually from that generation. But in any case, the story of this is that ultimately there's a lot that you can do if you use mathematics to look at what's going on in the world. At the very basic, it can help you to understand when there's a bigger situation than what people may have thought. This line that I read somewhere means a lot to me. How sometimes for a lot of people, they don't like math because it provides an inconvenient fact that is true. And so, unfortunately, sometimes we don't hear that fact said. But if you use the mathematics to think about it, oh wow, somebody started out on 8-track. But if you use that way of thinking, you can start to notice things that maybe people don't notice. And then at the end, it's like, well, if you can put together all the different types of math that we could try to bring to bear on a problem, well, maybe, just maybe, it could be that mathematics has something to play in trying to help us all get out of quarantine again, help us all get out again. The app that we made does not promise to solve the entire problem. On the other hand, it hopes to actually put a foundation in which you can then use to do all kinds of other interventions, all while being as respectful of privacy as possible. And so I will thank everybody for letting me change the topic that we were normally going to talk about today. To be perfectly honest, it's because after releasing that app, the amount of information, sorry, not information, but the amount of things that I had to respond to suddenly grew to be very, very high. My hope is that at least, even though it was a different topic, it happens to be something that might give you something you can talk about with your students. And my hope is that because we talked about so many different kinds of mathematics here, you will be able to find something for a very, very wide range of students, whether they are taking some very elementary math like percents, or whether they are taking all the way out to, this is Fourier analysis, this is calculus. Thank you, everybody. I want to offer for Math for America a chance to have a Q&A session because this was supposed to be for Math for America. I also know that teachers are very busy. But what we'll do for that is because of the fact that we have, I have this thing that I can draw on. If people have any particular questions that you wanted to ask, I can see in the Math for America chat. I'm happy to answer for maybe about 5 minutes, but I do understand people have places to go. So, and thank you for all of your comments. If there are any particular questions, I'm very happy to hit them. Oh, I actually don't need that particular one. I'm going to do it right through this way. I'm going to do it right through the YouTube Live. And the reason I'm going to do it right through the YouTube Live is because that way I can draw if I need to. So there are some questions. So did I use fast Fourier transform in the app? Yes. It's a fundamental part of signal processing. It also helps us to be more private. That way, even though we open the microphone, the first thing we do to it is Fourier transform it. So we don't actually know what we recorded. It's very important for privacy. Does it require microphone to be on all the time? No. But it turns on for these specific 1 second segments during which they are attempting to do some kind of range finding. Question, can I just say this is an odd function so the integral has to be 0? Almost. So the situation is that we're not integrating from minus t to plus t. We're integrating from 0 to t. So ultimately, since it's periodic, you could probably go and explain that since it's a periodic function, if the integral from minus something to the same plus the thing is 0, then probably since it's periodic, if you just shift it, it'll be still 0. That's a good question too. Other questions? So I'm just I have to scroll. Thank you for all your comments. It's actually very, very flattering, actually. So what do we have here? Okay, we did that. Oh, wow. Actually, so we've hit all of the questions in the past. Let me scroll down. What do we have? Thank you. Perhaps discuss how the linear algebra involved with query analysis and graph theory. Next time. Is there a next time? Look, I'm going to be on. I'll do another session in 2 weeks. I promise to do that. If it turns out that we go back to matrices, it will be. On the other hand, for all I know, I have actually no idea what's going to happen to my life in the next 2 weeks. I'll just be honest. In the last 3 weeks, my life changed completely. And the reason is because as soon as I got this idea, and as soon as I saw that, it is something that might work, and I also saw that the whole country was in lockdown and it was not very clear whether we have ability to make something happen in 3 weeks. I just said, I'll do it. And the fact that I also have a background in programming means that when it came time to implement all the Fourier transforms, I just, there are no sleeves today, but I just rolled up my sleeves and said, we've got to do this. I don't know what's going to happen in the next 2 weeks for me, because if this actually turns out to be something that is of somehow national significance, I might actually be trying to collaborate with people. But I will promise you, to me, I hold very strongly the idea that we need privacy. And that's why as a mathematician, I wanted to first see to what degree can you get this privacy to work. And the answer is, it works. You can use it. You can do all the privacy that you want. It works. So let's see. Other things, can the app be downloaded? So there's some questions here. Oh, let me make sure I'm doing somewhat in order. So thoughts about sharing this video with students? Go ahead. I'm actually very happy if you share it with students. I'm going to leave it on the YouTube. What you're watching here, it'll still be on the YouTube. You're welcome to watch it. Someday in the future, if I have time, I might take the footage I have and clean it up a little bit and get a higher quality version. But for now, we'll just leave it on YouTube. And if your students find it interesting, I'm very happy. Other things here. What's here? Can the app be downloaded at novid.org? Yes, it can. Novid.org for the Android. We have the Android package there. I do want to emphasize, though, this app is not perfect because I'm not Apple and I'm not Google. The reason why it's not perfect is because on your phone automatically has a protection that doesn't allow arbitrary apps to do things all the time. In fact, we tried very hard and we got around most of these, there's safety protections, and we're not hacking your phone, that's not what I mean. But we got past these things that usually make the phone not let you run something like this. But it doesn't run 100% reliably. So even though I want to sense nearbyness every 5 minutes, sometimes the phone just says, no sensing for an hour. If that's the case, it's not that it's useless. It's just that we detect an hour less of these useful connections between people. It just means that our measurement of the relationship network is not as good. But the status quo is called no information. So as far as we're concerned, it's still better than no information. And one of my big goals is, as this thing gets much higher adoption in the US, this will actually make a case to hopefully ask Google and Apple to at least give us the same access that they give to other major companies to be able to do certain things in their phones. Not things that invade your privacy, just things for which, for example, I want to at least be able to reliably issue a sensing command every 5 minutes, as opposed to being shut down. So yes, we're doing our best, and as this thing starts to gain momentum, we hopefully will be able to put out a real solution. Other things here. Oh yeah, thank you for your comments. Would I consider making a student version of this talk? I could. I think the main thing here is, I'm going to be honest. The way I usually decide how to allocate my time is a question of impact. So to me, it's like if I actually knew there would be a very large number of students who would want to do something. yeah, this is possible. The main thing is just how I allocate the time. I will say actually I do a live stream every single day between 4 and 5 o'clock p.m. Eastern time, but that's generally targeted towards people who are taking Algebra 1 and Geometry. That's actually what's run on this particular YouTube channel. If I wanted to talk to a different audience, I would just want to know that there's a critical mass of people who might want to join. Let's see, what do we have here? Great. Okay. Well, it looks like I ran through all the questions that we had here. I really appreciate that you listened to me for this long. This is just what I've been thinking about for 3 weeks. So, well, it's a real pleasure to be able to work with real teachers, and I wish everyone the best as we go through this very difficult time. I'm gonna sign off the YouTube. I'll go back to the Zoom very briefly and just hand it back over to John. So I'm just gonna sign off the YouTube. Everyone who is joining remotely, real pleasure to be able to have you online at the same time. I'll see all of you online tomorrow. See you.